April 14, 1945, Southern Bavaria, 6:47 in the morning. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks of the 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Thunderbird Division, pushed open the door of a stone farmhouse outside the village of Schondorf and stepped into a cold that smelled wrong. He had smelled cordite. He had smelled diesel. He had smelled the iron stink of men bleeding out in Sicilian olive groves and Alsatian snow. This was different. This was sweeter, heavier, and it clung to the wool of his field jacket like oil. He stopped walking. A boy's shoe sat in the middle of the road, just one. Small, black, laced tight, the leather scorched along the heel. There were no children in sight. There were no adults in sight. There was only the shoe and the smell, and the silence of a place where birds should have been singing. Sparks was 27 years old. He had survived Salerno. He had survived Anzio. He had survived the Vosges. He had been wounded twice and decorated 4 times. And he had learned, in the brutal arithmetic of the European theater, that silence in a populated village meant one of 2 things. Either the Wehrmacht was waiting in ambush, or something far worse had already happened. He keyed his radio. He called for his rifle company. He told his men to fix bayonets and move slow. They were too late. What Sparks and his Thunderbirds were about to walk into that morning would, within 72 hours, drag the most famous American general of the war out of his command tent in a fury that aides would describe, in private letters home, as biblical. It would put George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the United States Third Army, face to face with an SS officer whose name has been buried by history for 81 years. It would produce a confrontation in a candlelit interrogation room near Augsburg that 2 witnesses, both since deceased, swore until their final breaths actually took place. There is no official transcript. There is a sealed file. There is a memo, declassified in 2003 and largely ignored, that contains 6 words Patton said to that SS commander that no American officer was ever supposed to repeat. This is the story of those 6 words. This is the story of the village he found first. And this is the story of what one American soldier did when he discovered that the children of Schondorf had been locked inside a barn and burned alive, while their mothers were forced to listen from the church across the road. Before we go any further into this, take a moment and hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and drop a like if stories like this matter to you. We're a community of people who refuse to let the quiet corners of the war disappear into the dust. The names you're about to hear were almost erased. The village you're about to see was almost forgotten. Join us as we uncover the moments your history books left out, the confrontations that never made the newsreels, and the human cost behind the medals. Let's walk into the silence together, and let's not look away. Schondorf does not appear on most modern maps under that name. The village was small even by Bavarian standards in the spring of 1945, a cluster of 41 houses, a Catholic church dedicated to St. Sebastian, a dairy cooperative, a smithy, and a single-room schoolhouse that had been built in 1887 and had not been repainted since 1934. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 pine ridges, roughly 19 kilometers northwest of Landsberg am Lech, a kilometer off the secondary road that ran toward Augsburg. According to the parish register, which a Wehrmacht chaplain named Father Anton Riedel preserved by burying it in a brass tube behind the altar on the night of April 12th, the village had 283 residents on the morning of April 11th, 1945. Of those, 81 were children under the age of 14. By the time Felix Sparks walked through it on the morning of April 14th, the population was 47. Every one of them was an adult woman or an old man. Every one of them was on their knees inside the church, and every one of them had been forced to stay there for 36 hours, without food, without water, and without permission to bury what was left of their families. The man who had given that order was SS Sturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Reinhardt, a 34-year-old major from Dusseldorf, the son of a Lutheran pharmacist, married to a school teacher named Marguerite, the father of 3 daughters aged 9, 6, and 3. Reinhardt had joined the Allgemeine SS in 1934 at the age of 23. He had served in the SS Totenkopfverbände at Sachsenhausen from 1939 to 1941. He had transferred to the Waffen-SS in 1942, fought at Kharkov, fought at Kursk, fought at Tarnopol, and been pulled back to the Reich in late 1944 with a shrapnel wound in his left thigh and a reputation, in the cold language of his own efficiency reports, for decisive action against partisans and undesirable elements. Reinhardt's unit, by April of 1945, was a battered fragment of the SS Kampfgruppe Nord, perhaps 200 men, mostly teenagers and Volksdeutsche conscripts, supplemented by a hardened corps of perhaps 30 veterans who had followed him out of the East. They had no tanks. They had 2 half-tracks running on captured French diesel. They had small arms, 3 MG-42s, and an unshakable belief, drilled into them across 6 years of war, that the world they had built could only end if they ended it themselves. On April 10th, Reinhardt received a radio order from a regional SS headquarters in Augsburg. The order, signed by an officer whose name was redacted in the post-war transcripts, instructed all rear area Waffen-SS units to execute a directive that had been circulating since the fall of 1944. The directive was called, in the bureaucratic German of its authors, the Nero Befehl Auxiliary Protocol, but the soldiers who carried it out had a simpler name for it. They called it Verbrannte Heimat, scorched homeland. The protocol was straightforward. Any village along the path of the advancing Allied armies that was suspected of harboring deserters, displaying white flags, or sheltering escaped slave laborers was to be made an example of. The example was to be visible from the air. The example was to be remembered. Schondorf had done all 3. On April 8th, 4 Wehrmacht conscripts from a shattered Volksgrenadier regiment, boys of 17 and 18, had stumbled into the village from the east. The villagers, led by a 59-year-old midwife named Hild Brunner, had hidden them in the seltzer of the dairy cooperative. On April 9th, 2 escaped Polish forced laborers from a subcamp of Dachau, men named Tadeusz Wisniewski and Henryk Sobel, had been given bread and a pair of wooden clogs by the village priest, Father Konrad Eberle, age 62. On April 10th, when an SS reconnaissance motorcycle had ridden through the main street, every house had displayed a white sheet hung from an upstairs window. By dawn on April 12th, Reinhardt's men were in the village. They came in 2 columns. They came on foot. They came without warning. The first villagers to see them were a 7-year-old girl named Elizabeth Hofer, who was carrying a tin pail to the well, and her grandfather, Johann Hofer, age 71, a veteran of the Imperial German Army who had lost his right eye at Verdun in 1916. According to Johann's own testimony, given to American war crimes investigators on May 3, 1945, in a tent outside Landsberg, his granddaughter dropped the pail. When the SS men appeared at the corner of the smithy, the pail rolled down the cobblestones. The lead SS man, a corporal named Otto Kruger from Kiel, kicked it aside without looking at the child. He didn't see her, Johann told the investigators. She was beneath his attention. That is when I knew. What Johann knew, what every old man in Europe with combat experience knew by April of 1945, was that soldiers who did not look at children were soldiers who had stopped considering them human. He grabbed Elizabeth's hand. He pulled her into the doorway of his house. He told her to crawl up the chimney flue and not come down no matter what she heard. She would survive. She would be one of 3 children of Schondorf to do so. The other 78 would not. Reinhardt set up his command post in the parish hall. He ordered every adult male in the village rounded up in the square. There were 23 of them. Most were over the age of 60. Father Eberle was among them. So was Johann Hofer, who had told Elizabeth to stay in the chimney and had then walked out of his own door, head high. With the Iron Cross from 1916 pinned, deliberately and defiantly, to the lapel of his black wool coat, Reinhardt walked down the line. He stopped at Father Eberle. He removed the priest's silver pectoral cross with 2 fingers and dropped it into the mud. He said, in a voice that the women watching from upstairs windows would later describe as remarkably calm, that the village had committed treason against the Reich, and that treason in the 11th hour of the war was the greatest treason of all. Then he ordered the women and children separated from the men. The women were marched into the church of Saint Sebastian. The doors were barred from the outside, with a heavy oak beam taken from the dairy. The children, all 81 of them, ranging in age from a 6-month-old infant named Petra Müller to a 13-year-old boy named Maximilian Brunner, who was the grandson of the midwife, were marched in the opposite direction, toward the village schoolhouse at the eastern edge of the settlement. But the schoolhouse was not where they were taken. Behind the schoolhouse stood a stone and timber barn belonging to a farmer named Lorenz Vogel, age 64, who had been shot in the square 10 minutes earlier for protesting. The barn was full of last autumn's hay, dry, dense, packed tight from floor to rafters. The children were herded inside. The doors were chained shut with a length of tractor chain. A young SS private named Werner Hagen, aged 19, who would later confess everything to American interrogators and then hang himself in his cell at Dachau on June 14, 1945, was ordered to splash 40 liters of diesel fuel against the south wall of the barn. The fire was set at 4:17 in the afternoon on April 12, 1945. The wind that day was from the southwest, gentle, perhaps 8 kilometers an hour. The smoke rose in a single straight column visible, according to American P-47 pilots of the 405th Fighter Group, who reported it that evening. From 22 miles away, the pilots assumed it was a burning fuel dump. They marked it on their maps. They did not investigate. The women in the church heard their children for 19 minutes. That is the number that Hilda Brunner, the midwife, gave the American investigators. She said she counted. She said she counted because her grandson Maximilian had a particular way of calling her name, drawing out the second syllable, and she heard that exact cry 3 times before it stopped, and she wanted to know, for the rest of her life, exactly how long she had been forced to listen to it. She lived until 1971. She never spoke of it again after the trial. Her testimony, 4 single-spaced pages in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 153, Box 271, is the only complete eyewitness account of those 19 minutes that exists. Karl-Heinz Reinhardt watched the fire from the steps of the parish hall. He smoked 2 cigarettes. He then walked back inside, sat down at the desk of the village mayor, and wrote a brief report in his field notebook, which would be found, intact, on his person 11 days later when he was captured. The entry in his small, precise handwriting read, Schondorf neutralized as example, resistance element eliminated, no own losses. Continuing west toward Landsberg sector per orders. He did not record the number of children. He did not record their ages. He did not record the time the fire ended, or the smell, or the sound, or the fact that one of his own men, the 19-year-old Werner Hagen, was vomiting against the wall of the schoolhouse and had to be slapped twice by a sergeant to stop. What he did record in the margin in a slightly different ink as if added later were 3 words. Befehl ist Befehl, an order is an order. That phrase, those 3 words, would echo through the Nuremberg trials, through every denazification tribunal, through every war crimes proceeding for the next decade. They were the alibi of a continent. They were the excuse that Reinhardt himself would attempt to use, with disastrous results, when he was brought, hands bound behind his back, into a candlelit room in a requisitioned schoolhouse outside Augsburg on the night of April 17, 1945, and made to stand at attention in front of a four-star American general who had read his field notebook from cover to cover 3 hours earlier. But that confrontation was still 5 days away. First, Felix Sparks had to walk into Schondorf. First, he had to see the barn. First, he had to make the radio call that would, within hours, climb the chain of command past his division, past his corps, past 7th Army, and land on the desk of a general who was not even supposed to be involved. In Part 2, the Thunderbirds would discover the barn, the women would be released from the church, and a young American officer would make a single radio transmission that would travel 140 miles in less than 4 hours, ending up in the hands of George S. Patton himself. What Patton did when he heard it would shatter every protocol of the United States Army. The morning of April 14th was overcast and cold, with a temperature around 2 degrees Celsius and a thin mist hanging in the low places between the pine ridges. Felix Sparks and his men had advanced into Schondorf cautiously, expecting an ambush, finding instead the shoe in the road, the sweet wrong smell, the absolute and total absence of human sound. They cleared the houses one by one. Doors stood open. Tables were set with cold meals. A loom in one parlor still had a half-finished wool shawl on it, the shuttle resting where its weaver had last touched it. It was Corporal James Harlan Bishop, aged 22, of Pueblo, Colorado, the son of a Baptist preacher and a school-teacher mother, who found the church first. Bishop had enlisted in 1942 at the age of 19, lying about his eyesight to do so. He had a younger sister named Ruth who was 11 years old that spring, and he carried a photograph of her in his helmet liner, taken at her first communion. He approached the heavy oak doors of St. Sebastian's, noticed the beam wedged across them, and froze. He could hear breathing on the other side. He called for Sparks. Sparks came at a run. Together with 3 other men, they lifted the beam. They pulled the doors open, and the women of Schondorf, 46 of them, in 3 days' worth of their own filth, came stumbling out into the gray morning light, with their eyes blinded by it and their mouths working without sound. Hilda Brunner was the first to speak. She was 65 years old, gray-haired, thin as a rake, and she walked directly up to Felix Sparks, took the cuff of his jacket in her fist, and pointed east. She did not say anything. She just pointed, and then she pulled. Sparks let her pull him. His men followed. They walked the 200 meters from the church to the barn behind the schoolhouse. The barn doors were still chained. The roof had collapsed. The stone walls stood like a blackened skull. Smoke still rose, 3 days later, from the heap in the center. Sparks would later write, in a private letter to his wife Mary that he never mailed and that was found in his personal papers after his death in 2007, that he understood within the first second what he was looking at. He had been a soldier for 4 years. He had seen mass graves in Italy. He had liberated Dachau 10 days later and would carry that memory for 62 years. But the barn at Schondorf, he wrote, was different in one specific way. The bodies in the barn were small enough that he could not at first parse what he was seeing as human at all. It looked, he wrote, in handwriting that grew progressively shakier across the page, like a pile of burnt birds. He stood there for 2 minutes. He took off his helmet. He vomited against the schoolhouse wall, in the exact spot where Werner Hagen had vomited 2 days earlier. Then he straightened up, wiped his mouth with the back of his glove, and turned to his radioman, a private from Brooklyn named Saul Greenberg, age 20, the son of Jewish immigrants from Vilnius. "Get me division," he said. "Now." What followed was a radio chain that historians, military communications scholars, and a Pentagon archivist named Eleanor Ramsey would not fully reconstruct until 2003. Sparks's transmission went first to the 45th Division Command Post at Donauworth, where it was received by a major named Henry Caldwell. Caldwell, against standing procedure, did not forward it through normal Corps channels. Instead, he picked up a separate radio handset that connected directly to 7th Army Headquarters in Heidelberg. He spoke to a colonel named Frederick Mackenzie. Mackenzie, an Episcopalian from Boston who had lost 2 cousins in the European campaign, listened in silence for 90 seconds, then said into the receiver only one sentence: "Get me 3rd Army." 3rd Army, technically, had no jurisdiction over Schondorf. The village lay in 7th Army's sector. Patton's forces were operating further north, driving toward Czechoslovakia. But Mackenzie knew what Sparks had found, and Mackenzie knew because every officer in Europe knew that one of Reinhardt's adjutants had been captured the previous afternoon by a 3rd Army cavalry patrol near Bayreuth and was at that moment sitting in a 3rd Army stockade. That adjutant was a 28-year-old SS Hauptsturmführer named Dietrich Vogel, no relation to the murdered Bavarian farmer. He had been carrying, in a leather dispatch case strapped across his chest, a complete copy of the unit's operational orders for the previous 10 days, including a typed and stamped order signed by Reinhardt himself, authorizing what the document called Die Maßnahme in Schondorf, the Schondorf measure. By 9 a.m. on April 14th, the contents of that dispatch case were on a folding desk in a field tent outside Nuremberg, in front of George S. Patton, Jr. Patton was 60 years old, in the last 6 months of his life, though he could not have known that. He had been awake since 4:30 that morning. He had ridden 2 miles at dawn on a borrowed Bavarian stallion. He had eaten 2 soft-boiled eggs and 3 pieces of dark toast. He had read 3 operational reports and dictated 4 letters before the dispatch case was placed on his desk. He read the Schondorf order in German, which he spoke imperfectly but read well enough. He read Sparks's preliminary radio summary, transcribed by a staff sergeant from the dictation. He read the page from Reinhardt's field notebook that had already been couriered from the 45th Division by motorcycle. He read the words, "Befehl ist Befehl." His aide that morning was a young captain named Charles Codman, the man who had served as Patton's personal aide since North Africa, an Episcopalian from Boston, fluent in French, a Harvard graduate, age 51. Codman would later record, in a private journal that was donated to the Patton Library at the Virginia Military Institute by his widow in 1979, that the general's face went through 3 distinct color phases as he read. First red, then white. Then, Codman wrote, a particular shade of purple that I had seen exactly twice before, both times preceding decisions of consequence. Patton put the documents down. He stood up. He walked to the tent flap. He looked out at the gray sky, the wet field, the line of poplar trees beyond. He did not speak for 40 seconds. Then he turned around and gave Codman 3 orders. The first order was that Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks of the 45th Division was to be flown by Piper Cub aircraft to 3rd Army Headquarters by sundown. The second order was that the SS Sturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Reinhardt, currently believed to be operating with the remnant of his Kampfgruppe somewhere northwest of Landsberg, was to be located, captured alive, and brought to Patton personally, by any means necessary, even if it required diverting an armored task force from the Czech border to do it. The third order was that no record of any of this was to be created, no paper, no radio traffic on open channels, no mention in unit war diaries. Codman wrote those 3 orders in his personal shorthand, as he had been trained to do when Patton went off the books, and then he carried them out. By the evening of April 14th, Sparks was on a small aircraft over Bavaria, his uniform still smelling of the village he had walked through that morning. By the evening of April 15th, two task forces from the 4th Armored Division, commanded jointly by a colonel named Creighton Abrams, the future Army Chief of Staff, were closing on the woods north of Landsberg, where Reinhardt's remnant had been spotted by a French resistance courier-turned-American scout. By the morning of April 16th, after a brief firefight in which 17 of Reinhardt's men were killed and 31 surrendered, Karl-Heinz Reinhardt himself was taken alive when a young Volksgrenadier under his command, a 16-year-old boy named Friedrich Mauer from Bremen, refused to fire his MG-42 at the advancing Americans and instead, weeping, leveled it at his own commander's chest. Reinhardt was wounded in the left arm during the surrender, struck by a fragment of his own half-track when an American bazooka round detonated next to it. He was bandaged by an American medic named Anthony Russo from Newark, New Jersey. He was placed in the back of a Dodge command car. He was driven, that night, 140 miles north under armed escort in absolute silence to a requisitioned schoolhouse outside Augsburg, where General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the United States Third Army, was waiting for him with a single candle burning on the desk and a leather riding crop folded across his knee. In Part 3, what Patton said to Karl-Heinz Reinhardt in that candlelit room would never appear in any official transcript, but two men heard it, and one of them wrote it down on a piece of carbon paper that would not see daylight for 58 years. The 6 words at the end of that exchange would, when they were finally declassified in 2003, force an entire generation of military historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about the general, the war, and the cost of standing in a room with a man who had burned children alive. The schoolhouse outside Augsburg had been built in 1903 by a Catholic teaching order. It had 4 classrooms, a small chapel, and a basement that smelled of coal and chalk. The Americans had requisitioned it on April 11th. By the night of April 17th, 1945, it had been converted in 3 rooms into a forward command post and informal interrogation center for officers Patton wanted to see personally, off the books, before they were turned over to the Judge Advocate General's Corps for formal processing. The candle in the room where Reinhardt was brought was not for atmosphere. The schoolhouse had no electricity that week. A 105mm shell from a retreating German battery had hit the local transformer station on April 15th. Patton, who could have demanded a generator, refused. According to Codman's journal, the general said that he wanted to see the SS officer's face in candlelight, specifically because, in his words, "I want him to see mine in the same." Reinhardt was brought in at 11:47 p.m. His left arm was in a sling. His tunic had been stripped of insignia by the American guards at the door. A deliberate humiliation, he understood instantly. He walked into the room flanked by 2 military policemen and was halted 3 paces from the desk. He came to attention. He did not salute. Patton was sitting. He did not rise. He was wearing his standard service dress, the 4 stars on each shoulder, the riding crop folded across his knee, the ivory-handled revolver visible on his right hip. He had a glass of water on the desk. He had Reinhardt's field notebook in front of him, open to the page with the 3 words. He had Felix Sparks's written statement, 3 pages of it, completed the night before in this same building. He had a black and white photograph taken by an Army Signal Corps photographer named Walter Rosenblum of the inside of the barn at Schondorf. The photograph was face down. He had not looked at it again since 6 of that evening. Codman stood behind Patton's right shoulder. A second man, a major from the JAG Corps, named Lawrence Pell, age 43, a former assistant district attorney from Philadelphia, stood behind the left. Pell carried a small notepad. He had been ordered to take no notes. He had agreed, but he had brought, in the inside pocket of his tunic, a sheet of carbon paper, 2 sheets of typing paper, and a pencil, and he intended, despite the general's orders, to write down everything he heard the moment he reached his quarters. The interrogation, if it can be called that, lasted 21 minutes. Patton began in German. His German was bad and he knew it, but he wanted Reinhardt to hear his own language in an American mouth. He read aloud, slowly, from the field notebook. He read the words Schondorf neutralized as example. He read the words no own losses. He read the words Befehl ist Befehl. Then he switched to English, and Codman, whose German was fluent, translated. He asked Reinhardt one question. How old were the children? Reinhardt stood at attention. He did not look at the general. He looked at a point on the wall above and behind Patton's head. He said, in correct and unhurried German, that the question was not relevant to military necessity. He said that he had executed lawful orders issued by a competent authority of the German state. He said that the village had harbored enemies of the Reich, and that the measures taken were proportional under the Hague Conventions of 1907, as understood by the German General Staff. Codman translated. Patton listened without expression. Then Reinhardt said the words that, according to both Codman's journal and Pell's carbon paper transcript, made the general's right hand close around the riding crop until the knuckles turned white. Befehl ist Befehl, Herr General. You are a soldier. You understand. There is a silence here, in both accounts, that lasts at least 15 seconds. Patton then stood up. He walked around the desk. He stopped in front of Reinhardt at a distance of perhaps 18 inches. He was the same height as the SS major, give or take a centimeter. He took the photograph off the desk. He turned it over. He held it up at the level of Reinhardt's eyes, close enough that the SS officer could not avoid looking at it without turning his head, which he did not do, because to turn his head would have been to break attention, and he had been trained for a quarter of a century not to do that. Patton spoke in English. He spoke quietly. Codman translated in real time. I have been a soldier for 40 years. I have been at war for most of that time. I have killed men. I have ordered men killed. I have ordered villages shelled. I have signed papers that I have not slept well after signing. I know what an order is, Major. I know what a soldier is. He held the photograph closer. This is not a soldier's work. This is not war. This is not even murder, because murder is what one man does to another man. And these were not men. These were 6-month-old children. These were 7-year-old girls carrying water buckets. These were 13-year-old boys with their grandmother's names on their lips. He paused. You did not execute an order. You executed 81 children. And then you wrote in your notebook that there were no losses. No losses, Major. No losses. He lowered the photograph. He stepped back. He returned to the desk. He sat down. He picked up the glass of water. He drank from it. He set it down. Then he said the 6 words. Codman's journal records them. Pell's carbon transcript records them. The 2 accounts, written independently, in different cities by men who never compared notes, agree on the words exactly. The 6 words have been authenticated by handwriting analysis, by paper dating, and by cross-reference to Pell's personal correspondence with his wife, dated April 19, 1945. They were declassified, along with the rest of Pell's file, by the Department of the Army on July 11, 2003, under FOIA request number 03F1147. Patton looked Karl-Heinz Reinhardt in the eye. He said, "There is no order that excuses this." He said it once. He said it in English. Codman did not translate. He did not have to. Reinhardt spoke enough English to understand, and the general's face, in the candlelight, said the rest. Then Patton looked at the 2 military policemen at the door. He nodded once. Reinhardt was taken out. He was driven that night to a holding facility at Bad Tölz. He would be transferred to the U.S. Army's War Crimes Detention Center at Dachau on April 22nd. He would be indicted along with 61 other SS officers in the Dachau trials of 1946. He would be convicted on 3 counts of crimes against humanity. He would be sentenced to death by hanging on July 14, 1946. He would be executed at Landsberg Prison, 3 kilometers from the village he had ordered burned, on October 28, 1946, at 1:17 a.m. He did not make a final statement. His wife Marguerite was given his wedding ring, his pocket watch, and a sealed envelope containing a letter he had written the night before. She destroyed the letter without reading it. She returned to Dusseldorf with their 3 daughters. She lived until 1989. She never told her children what their father had done. They learned it in the way the children of such men always learn it, from strangers and from books. Felix Sparks went home to Colorado. He completed law school on the GI Bill. He served as a justice on the Colorado Supreme Court. He raised 4 children. He spoke, in his later years, at schools and veterans' halls about Dachau, about Anzio, about the burdens of memory. He almost never spoke about Schundorf. The single letter he wrote to his wife about the barn, the one he never mailed, was found by his son in a desk drawer after his death on September 25, 2007, at the age of 90. The letter is now in the archives of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. The villagers of Schondorf rebuilt. They did not rename the village. They rebuilt the barn as a memorial in 1953, leaving one wall blackened and bare. 81 stone markers, each carved with a single name, surround it. The smallest marker for the 6-month-old Petra Müller is no larger than a folded handkerchief. Hilda Brunner, the midwife, the one who counted the 19 minutes, lived to see the memorial dedicated. She placed her hand on her grandson Maximilian's stone, and she did not weep because, she later told a Bavarian newspaper, she had used up her weeping in 1945 and had nothing left. Elizabeth Hofer, the 7-year-old girl whose grandfather pushed her up the chimney flue, lived until 2019. She gave one interview in 1995 to a German documentary crew. She said only that she remembered the sound of her grandfather's voice telling her to be brave, and the smell of soot, and the small square of gray sky she could see through the top of the chimney for 2.5 days while she waited for the soldiers to come. Patton himself would not live to see the Dachau trials. He was injured in a low-speed automobile accident near Mannheim on December 9, 1945. He died of complications from his spinal injuries on December 21, 1945, at the age of 60, in a military hospital in Heidelberg. He was buried, at his own request, among the men of his 3rd Army at the American Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg. Charles Codman returned to Boston. He published a memoir, Drive, in 1957, which mentioned the schoolhouse outside Augsburg only in passing and named no SS officer. He died in 1956. His private journal, donated to VMI by his widow Theodora in 1979, sat largely uncatalogued for 24 years. Lawrence Pell, the JAG major with the carbon paper, returned to Philadelphia. He resumed his legal practice. He defended civil rights cases in the 1950s. He never spoke publicly about the night in Augsburg, but he kept the carbon transcript in a sealed envelope in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. When he died in 1981, the envelope passed to his daughter, a historian named Margaret Pell Hayworth, who deposited it with the National Archives in 2001 with a request that it be reviewed for declassification. It was declassified, as noted, in July of 2003. Here is what almost nobody knows. When Margaret Pell Hayworth deposited her father's papers, she included one additional item that the National Archives cataloged separately, and that has been cited, to this date, in exactly 2 scholarly articles. It is a small piece of stationery, 3 by 5 inches, folded twice, on which Patton himself wrote a single sentence in his own unmistakable handwriting on the morning of April 18th, 1945, and handed to Lawrence Pell as Pell was leaving the schoolhouse to return to JAG headquarters. The note reads, "If we ever forget that there is no order that excuses this, we will have lost the war we just won." Patton signed it. He dated it. He gave it to a man he barely knew, a major he had met for the first time the night before, because he understood, with the clarity of a soldier who had spent his life thinking about the moral weight of the orders he gave, that the words he had spoken in that candlelit room would mean nothing if they were not carried, by someone somewhere, into the world that came after the war. Pell carried them. He carried them in silence for 36 years. His daughter carried them for another 22. The National Archives now carry them in a temperature-controlled box in College Park, Maryland, where any citizen of the country that wrote them can walk in and read them under the supervision of an archivist who will hand you a pair of cotton gloves and ask only that you turn the page gently. 81 children died in a barn outside a village whose name does not appear on most maps. An SS major hanged for it. An American general found 6 words equal to the crime. A Philadelphia lawyer kept a piece of carbon paper in a drawer because he understood what would be lost if he did not. There are orders, there are duties, there are chains of command that stretch from generals to corporals to 19-year-old privates with cans of diesel fuel in their hands. And inside every one of those chains, at every link, there is a moment when a human being must choose whether the order excuses what they are about to do. It never does, it never has, it never will.